BMW spent the mid-90s building the finest driver's car in the executive segment. Mercedes spent the same period trying to remove 30% of the cost from the car that followed the W124, the sedan that taxi drivers in Frankfurt and Damascus ran to 500,000 kilometers without rebuilding. One of those decisions produced a vehicle that engineers still point to when asked what they wish they could build again. The other produced spring perches that corroded through while the car was still moving. Same price, same segment, same German engineering heritage. But one of them proved that the best things are built when nobody is counting the cost. And the other proved that when you start counting, the damage is irreversible. So, which philosophy actually kills a legend? The accountant's red pen or the engineer's blank check? We start with the blank check. In 1995, BMW produced the last 5 series developed before the company's engineering culture began to shift toward design. At the time, no one recognized it as a turning point. That only becomes clear in retrospect when you see what came after. The car was the BMW E39 5 Series. At launch, it was immediately positioned as the benchmark for the executive segment. Autocar described it as the best executive car in the world. Car and Driver placed it on its 10 best list every year of its North American production run. Road and Track featured the M5 variant, with a headline calling it the greatest performance sedan ever built. And when its replacement arrived in 2003, the reaction was not neutral. It was mourning. The kind of response that only happens when a replacement fails to deliver something its predecessor made feel essential. In the years since, the E39 has continued to gain value, financially, reputationally, and emotionally, in the way that objects do when they cannot be recreated. So, how does a car built by a large, publicly traded automaker become the one that engineers later point to as the car they wish they could build again? To understand that, you have to go back to 1993, when BMW was beginning to change, and when a new design direction was introduced under a mandate that would reshape the company's identity. The BMW 5 Series has always occupied a specific position in the company's hierarchy. It is not the halo car, that is the M Series sports models and the flagship 7 Series, and it is not the entry point, that is the 3 Series. The 5 Series is the car that carries BMW's core promise to the largest number of people who can afford to experience it. It is the car that most people who buy BMW actually mean when they say they want a BMW, which means that getting it wrong is more consequential than getting any other model in the range wrong. The E34, which the E39 replaced, had been a competent car. By the early 1990s, it was aging. The platform architecture dated to the early 80s. The interior had not kept pace with the premium interior quality being established by the Lexus LS400 and the Mercedes W124. The suspension, while capable, was showing the limits of its design. BMW needed a successor that would not merely be competitive, but definitively ahead. A car that would make the case, without qualification, that a BMW 5 Series was the finest executive car in the world. The competitive pressure that made this argument urgent was coming from Japan. The Lexus LS400 had arrived in 1989 with a specific mandate: to humiliate the Germans, and had executed it precisely enough that Mercedes had delayed the launch of the W140 S-Class to revise it in response. Toyota had spent $1 billion building a car that was quieter, smoother, more reliable, and significantly cheaper than the German alternatives. The automotive press had noticed, buyers had noticed. The German manufacturers could no longer assume that their heritage justified their prices. They had to demonstrate with each new generation that the product actually delivered something the Japanese cars could not. For BMW, this demonstration was clearer than it was for Mercedes. BMW's competitive advantage was not luxury in the conventional sense. It was not wood and leather and silence. It was the driving experience. It was the feeling, specific to BMWs of the era and not fully replicated elsewhere, that the car was an extension of the driver's intentions rather than a vehicle the driver was managing from inside. This was harder for Toyota to replicate than acoustic isolation, because it was embedded in the chassis geometry and the suspension calibration and the steering setup, rather than in the materials and the sound deadening. BMW's engineering culture had a specific advantage that its marketing culture was already beginning to understand and amplify. The slogan, "The ultimate driving machine," was not advertising. It was a technical brief. The development brief went to a team led by Chief Engineer Wolfgang Reitzle, who had been overseeing BMW product development since the mid-80s, and whose engineering philosophy was specific to the point of being a personal conviction. Reitzle believed that the primary purpose of a BMW was the driving experience, and that every engineering decision should be evaluated against that standard before any other. He was not interested in building the quietest car in the segment, or the most technologically complex, or the most comfortable. He was interested in building the most rewarding car to drive. Everything else, comfort, refinement, technology, was secondary to that goal, and acceptable only insofar as it did not compromise the driving experience it served. This philosophy sounds simple. In practice, it required a discipline that is rare in corporate product development. It meant spending development resources on chassis geometry rather than cabin materials. It meant calibrating suspension bushings by feel rather than specification. It meant going back and rebuilding a prototype because the steering wheel center point did not feel right at 150 kilometers per hour, even though the specification said it was within tolerance. There is a documented instance from the E39's development in which a prototype was rejected and rebuilt because the damping on a specific set of road conditions, the kind of road surface found on certain sections of the Autobahn between Munich and Stuttgart, produced a response that the test engineers found slightly disconnected from what the chassis was actually doing. Not wrong, not broken, slightly disconnected. That was enough to fail it. BMW invested approximately 2 billion Deutsche Marks in the E39 program, a sum that reflected both the importance of the 5 Series to the company's revenues and the determination to produce something that would define the segment. The car entered development in the early 1990s and went on sale in Europe in November of 1995. North America received it in 1997 as a 1998 model year vehicle. It remained in production until 2003, when the E60 replaced it. Here is what nobody says enough about the timing. When the E39 launched, Chris Bangle had been BMW's design director for 2 years. Bangle had arrived from Opel in 1992 with a mandate to transform the brand's visual identity, or to make BMW cars look more distinctive, more bold, more designed. The tension between Bangle's vision and Reitzle's engineering culture would define BMW's product decisions for the decade that followed. But the E39's exterior had been finalized before Bangle's influence had fully penetrated the product planning process. The interior had been finalized. The chassis tuning had been completed. The E39 was the last BMW produced entirely by the engineering culture that Reitzle ran. Bangle's influence would define the E60 that followed. The E60 arrived in 2003, with a styling language that divided opinion sharply, and with a driving character that enthusiasts found lacking in the precision and communication of its predecessor. BMW sold more E60s than E39s. The business case for Bangle's approach was clear, but the driving experience, the quality that BMW's engineering culture had always considered primary, was diminished. That transition from the E39 to the E60 is the moment that the E39's reputation crystallized. It became the last one before something changed, the artifact of an approach that the company's own subsequent decisions proved could not be maintained. The E39's chassis is the reason the car has the reputation it does. It begins with a choice that BMW made in the 1930s and has never abandoned: rear-wheel drive and a longitudinally mounted engine placed as far back in the engine bay as packaging will allow. This architecture gives BMW its fundamental dynamic character, a weight distribution close to 50-50, a steering system uncomplicated by the need to transmit drive force through the same axle that steers, and a rear end that can be managed by a skilled driver in a way that front-wheel drive cars simply cannot replicate. But architecture is only the beginning. What the E39 did with that architecture is what separates it. The front suspension is BMW's double-pivot strut design, an arrangement they called the central axis front suspension. This is more complex than a conventional McPherson strut, using 2 separate pivot points to control the wheel's movement rather than one. The significance of the extra pivot is not in the geometry it produces when the car is traveling straight. It is in the geometry it maintains when the car is braking hard, accelerating hard, or transitioning between the two. In a conventional strut suspension, braking forces feed back into the steering, producing a tugging sensation in the wheel and reducing precision. BMW's double pivot arrangement isolates those forces. The result is a steering response under braking that is cleaner, more precise, and more useful to a driver trying to place a car accurately at speed. The rear suspension is a multi-link design that BMW calls the Z-axle. 5 links per side, 3 lateral and 2 longitudinal, control each rear wheel through its range of motion with a geometry precision that a simpler design cannot match. The geometry is calibrated to produce a specific passive behavior under lateral load. As cornering forces build, the rear wheels toe slightly inward, increasing stability and resisting the tendency to oversteer. This is not an electronic intervention. It is a purely mechanical effect, produced by the physical geometry of the link arrangement. It required extensive development work to calibrate correctly. The precise angles of each link, the stiffness of each bush, the interaction between the links under combined loads, and the result is a rear end that feels planted, communicative, and neutral in a way that electronic stability systems can approximate but not replicate. Here is the engineering detail that separates the E39 from most of what existed alongside it. The Z-axle was calibrated specifically for the E39's weight and weight distribution. This was not a generic multi-link setup borrowed from another platform and adapted. It was engineered from the ground up for this specific car, on this specific wheelbase, with this specific engine placement. The mounting points were designed to accommodate the subframe geometry at a specific compression range, and the bush stiffnesses were set to produce the toe-in response at lateral acceleration levels that reflected how the car would actually be driven. This level of platform-specific development is extraordinarily expensive. It is also the reason the E39 handles differently from everything else. The steering is a hydraulic rack and pinion with variable assistance, heavier at speed, lighter at parking velocities. The calibration of this system is the single most discussed aspect of the E39 among enthusiasts, and for good reason. The weight and the feedback are close to ideal for a road car of this size. At parking speeds, it is effortless. At motorway speeds, it is firm enough that small, precise inputs produce small, precise changes in direction. It communicates the front tire's grip level through the rim of the wheel in a way that modern electrically assisted systems, tuned for isolation rather than communication, do not. You can feel the road surface through an E39 steering wheel. You can feel the onset of understeer before it develops fully, which allows a competent driver to respond before the correction becomes obvious. The inline-6 engines that powered the most popular E39 variants are the other half of the car's driving reputation. The M52 in the 528 produces 193 horsepower from 2.8 liters. The M54 in the 530 produces 225 horsepower from 3 liters. Both are all aluminum engines, block and head, with double overhead camshafts and BMW's Vanos variable valve timing system. The aluminum construction saves approximately 30 kilograms compared to an equivalent iron block engine, which matters in a car whose chassis calibration was done with a specific weight distribution in mind. The Vanos system, BMW's acronym for Variable Nockenwellen-Steuerung, variable camshaft timing, adjusts the phase relationship between the camshafts and the crankshaft, allowing the engine to optimize its valve timing across the rev range rather than accepting a single compromise setting. This was not unique to BMW in the mid-90s, but BMW's implementation was more sophisticated than most, and the combination of Vanos with the inline-6's inherently smooth power delivery produced an engine character that the automotive press consistently described as the benchmark in its class. The character of these engines is the quality that is hardest to describe without experiencing it. BMW inline-6 engines of this generation produce their power in a way that is almost perfectly linear. There is no surge, no step, no drama in the power delivery. The throttle response is immediate and proportional. The engine note rises cleanly with revs, becoming more urgent at higher speeds, but never harsh or strained. At full throttle, the combination of sound and acceleration has a quality that the word refined does not fully capture. because refinement implies polish over rawness. What the BMW inline 6 offers is something different, a precision in the delivery of its considerable capability that feels earned rather than suppressed. The V8 in the 540R, the M62, producing 286 horsepower from 4.4 liters, is a different instrument. It is quieter at idle, smoother at low revs, and more effortlessly fast in the way that displacement always is. But it does not reward being worked in the same way the inline 6 does. It is a touring engine in a touring car. The E39 540 is perhaps the finest long-distance express available for its money, but it is not the E39 that enthusiasts think of when they think of the car. There is one detail about the E39's build quality that the specification sheets do not capture, but that mechanics who work on these cars discuss consistently. The tolerances in the E39's assembly are tighter than those of contemporary competitors. Panel gaps are even and consistent. The switchgear operates with a damped precision that does not degrade with use because the components that produce it, the springs, the detents, the grease specifications, were selected for their durability under the operating conditions of a car that would be used every day for 20 years. BMW tested the volume knob, the window switches, and the climate controls through hundreds of thousands of operating cycles before approving them. This is not visible to the buyer. It is not advertised. It is felt over time as the car accumulates miles and the controls continue to operate with the same resistance and the same click that they had on the day it was new. The E39's galvanization is thorough. BMW had learned from the rust problems that affected their products in the 1970s and 80s, and the E39 generation applied anti-corrosion protection to a standard that the car's primary competitor, as events would prove, had failed to maintain. The body panels are treated before painting. The seams are sealed. The cavities are injected with wax. An E39 in a Rust Belt state will develop surface corrosion with age, as all vehicles do, but it does so predictably and in non-structural areas. The structural elements, the sills, the floor pan, the chassis rails, hold. This distinction, which seemed unremarkable at the time, because it was simply what German cars were expected to do, became the most important distinction in the segment when the W210 arrived and demonstrated that it was no longer universal. The E39 M5 deserves its own section because its reputation changes how every other E39 is perceived. It entered production in 1998 and was sold until 2003. In those 5 years, BMW produced approximately 20,000 units worldwide, a deliberately limited number that reflected MGMBH's hand assembly capacity. It was never a common sight on the road. It is now one of the most sought-after performance sedans of its era. There is a story that captures what the E39 M5 was. BMW's M Division engineers were completing high-speed evaluation at Ferrari's Fiorano test facility in Italy. During a straight-line acceleration run from a standing start to 160 kilometers per hour, the M5 was run alongside a Ferrari 360 Modena. The M5 reached the mark first. A hand-built, naturally aspirated 400 horsepower sedan from Munich had put the Ferrari behind it in a straight line. The M5's engineers described it as the moment the team understood what they had made. Ferrari's people, by contemporary accounts, said nothing and requested another run. The result was the same. The M5's engine, the S62, 5 liters, 400 horsepower, was built entirely within the MGMBH facility in Garching, separate from the main BMW production. Each S62 engine was assembled by a single technician from start to finish. When assembly was complete, that technician attached a small aluminum plaque to the engine bearing their name. The car you drove had been built by one person who had signed it. Consider the context. At the same moment Toyota was completing a Corolla in 18 hours on an automated production line, BMW was building M5 engines one at a time, by hand, with a name attached to each one. The result was an engine that mechanics describe consistently. Every clearance is correct, every torque value is correct. Nothing is loose, and nothing is tight. It has the quality of something assembled by someone who understood what they were building and cared whether it was right. What the M5 provided, beyond its own exceptional capability, was permission for the entire E39 range to be understood differently. If you drove a 528i and knew that the same platform, the same chassis geometry, the same steering calibration could be made into a car that outran a Ferrari, the 528i felt different in your hands. The capability was latent in the architecture. The engineers had not compromised the fundamentals to serve the standard car's brief. You were driving a chassis that had been developed without the usual limitations. The departure of Wolfgang Reitzle in 1999 is a structural event in this story. Reitzle lost the competition for BMW's chief executive position to Joachim Milberg and left to join Ford, where he would oversee the acquisition of Jaguar and Land Rover. His departure marked the beginning of the institutional transition that would produce the E60. The E60 was faster in several dimensions, more technologically complex, and considerably more controversial. The driving experience that the E39 had been calibrated to deliver was diminished. BMW's subsequent 5 series have sold in larger numbers and generated more revenue. None of them have been called the finest driver's car in the executive segment. The E39 community is global, technically sophisticated, and disproportionately represented in the enthusiast press relative to the car's production numbers. This community formed around the car's capabilities rather than its failures. A meaningful distinction. The E39 attracts people who value the driving experience, and the community reflects that. Technical discussions are detailed and precise. Maintenance guides are thorough. The modification culture is predominantly aimed at preserving and enhancing the car's dynamic character, rather than transforming it into something else. The E39's known failure points are real and must be stated clearly. The Vanos variable valve timing unit contains seals that deteriorate with age, causing timing malfunction, loss of low-end torque, and a cold start rattle. The repair requires disassembling the front of the engine. Every high-mileage E39 six-cylinder will eventually require it. The cooling system, plastic thermostat housing, plastic expansion tank, plastic radiator end caps. Fails predictably with age and heat cycling. The community's standard guidance is to replace all plastic cooling components at 100,000 miles, regardless of apparent condition, because the failure mode is a rapid coolant loss that can damage the engine before the driver recognizes the problem. The rear subframe mounting points can crack on high-mileage cars, a structural issue that requires body shop reinforcement. These are real costs of ownership. They are the price of driving something that was engineered to be excellent rather than economical to produce. The E39 is one of the few cars from this era that has genuinely appreciated in collector value while remaining usable as a daily driver. The M5 has appreciated dramatically. Well-maintained low-mileage examples now sell for prices that rival contemporary sports cars. The Touring, which was one of the best-selling estate cars in Europe during its production run, is increasingly recognized as the complete version of the platform. BMW engineers use the Touring as the structural development partner for the sedan because its greater torsional rigidity allowed them to better evaluate the chassis' behavior when unbothered by the flexing that is inherent in a convertible or open-body structure. The Touring E39, more than the sedan, shows the chassis at its most composed. There is one detail about the E39's production run that the enthusiast press does not mention often enough. In Germany, variants of the E39 were used by unmarked police units, primarily the Autobahnpolizei, for high-speed patrol and pursuit, not the M5 specifically, though that would have been the obvious choice. The 540i, with its combination of V8 performance and executive car anonymity, was a common sight in federal traffic enforcement. The choice reflects something about the car's character. It could maintain sustained high-speed operation on the Autobahn without drama, without the kind of mechanical stress that track-focused performance cars experience at their limits, and without drawing attention to itself. The car that looked like a car for architects and lawyers was also, quietly, the car that the highway police trusted to do the job. That is what a blank check looks like when the engineers are the ones holding it. The result was a car so precisely calibrated that, decades later, its own creators would still point to it as the standard they wish they could return to. The M5 could match performance cars that were never meant to share its category. A standard 528, I could sustain autobahn speeds with a level of composure that made it trusted by highway police. Even the touring variant became a development reference within BMW because its structural rigidity revealed the true behavior of the chassis in a way the sedan could not. But while BMW was building its benchmark, Mercedes was entering a very different phase. Production of the W124 had just ended. The engineers who had spent over a decade refining what many considered the definitive Mercedes sedan, known for durability measured in hundreds of thousands of kilometers, were given a new directive. That directive came with a number: 30%. Not a marginal reduction, a structural one. So, what happens when you remove 30% of the cost from a car that had been engineered without excess? By the late 1990s, the answer was already visible. It showed up in daily use, in taxi fleets, in long-term ownership, and in the automotive press that had once documented the strengths of German engineering and was now recording its decline with equal precision. So, how does the benchmark for durability become the car defined by compromised materials and visible deterioration? To understand that, you have to go back to 1995, the moment when control shifted from engineers to accountants. In 1995, Mercedes-Benz introduced the car that was meant to replace the W124. The W124 had been in production for 11 years and had built a reputation for durability that few cars had ever matched. Taxi fleets in Germany, the Middle East, and North Africa routinely ran them to 500,000 kilometers on their original engines. Engineers referred to it as the tank. The automotive press described it as the finest production sedan in the world. Its owners simply called it reliable. It was trusted across conditions, across markets, and across decades. The W210 arrived to replace all of that. And almost immediately, something was different. The cars began to rust, early, visibly, and in ways that were difficult to ignore. Instrument clusters failed, central locking systems malfunctioned. More critically, structural components like the front spring perches corroded to the point of failure on some vehicles. This was not a gradual decline, it was a break. On a car that carried the expectation of lasting decades, visible corrosion appeared within just a few years. The timing made it worse. The W210 entered the market with the full weight of the W124's reputation behind it. Buyers did not question durability. They assumed it. The problem did not appear at the dealership. It appeared years later in parking garages and service bays when the cars were already owned. By then, the transaction was complete. The expectation remained. But the result had changed. The W210 is not the story of a bad car. It is the story of a good car that was compromised by decisions made above the engineering level, decisions that removed the margins that had made its predecessor exceptional. In order to meet financial targets the company believed it needed, those decisions were shaped at the executive level, and they did not begin with the W210. To understand the W210, you have to go back to the car that came before it, not the W124, but the W140. The W140 S-Class, introduced in 1991, was the last Mercedes built under an unlimited engineering mandate. It was designed to be the best car in the world, without constraint, and it achieved that goal completely. But it arrived at a cost the company could not sustain. The W140 was enormous. The development team had been given no dimensional constraints. The wheelbase grew to the point where the car no longer fit comfortably in standard European parking spaces. The body was so heavy that Mercedes had to develop new hydraulic door closing mechanisms, automatic cinching systems that pulled the heavy doors fully shut when the driver pushed them gently. The vehicle weighed over 2,000 kilograms in standard form. The drag coefficient was low and the aerodynamics were excellent, but the physical mass meant fuel consumption that the market, entering a recession, found increasingly uncomfortable to defend. The development costs had consumed an extraordinary amount of resources. The production costs were high. The warranty claims, as the W140's complex electrical systems, which included over 100 separate control modules, began to generate the kind of intermittent faults that complex systems always eventually produce, were significant. The W140 sold because it was genuinely the finest car in the world, but it sold at margins that alarmed the Daimler-Benz board. And it arrived in 1991, the year the global recession began, wearing a body language that the political and media's environment of the time found offensive. The car was called the Panzerwagen, the tank car, but not with the affection that the W124 had earned that nickname. It was said with the implication of excess, of resources misallocated, of engineering for engineering's sake rather than engineering for people. Jürgen Schrempp arrived as chief executive of Daimler-Benz in May of 1995, the same year the W210 launched, with a mandate from the board to transform the company's financial performance. Schrempp was not an engineer. He was a strategist, an acquirer, and above all, a cost reducer. He had spent the preceding years running Mercedes-Benz South Africa and then the DESA aerospace division, where he had earned a reputation for executing ruthless efficiency programs. He brought those methods to Stuttgart. Schremp's stated diagnosis of Mercedes' problem was that the company had been over-engineering its products, spending more on each vehicle than the market would reward at the price points they could actually achieve. His prescription was a 30% reduction in the manufacturing cost of the next generation of products. The W210 was in the final stages of development when Schrempp arrived. The directive reached the engineering team at a point when the car's fundamental architecture was fixed, but its material specifications, its corrosion protection processes, and its component quality targets were still subject to revision. The engineers were told to find the savings. They found them. Here is the specific detail that makes the W210 story different from a simple quality control failure. The engineering team at Mercedes in the mid-90s was not incompetent. The people who designed the W124 were, in some cases, still employed. The institutional knowledge of what the W124 had required was present. The engineers who received the 30% brief knew precisely what they were being asked to remove, because they had spent their careers building the thing that was being removed. This is not a story about engineers who did not know how to build a good car. It is a story about engineers who knew exactly what a good car required and were told they could not have the budget to provide it. The specific material changes that produced the W210's rust problem are documented in Mercedes' own technical records and have been discussed extensively in the German automotive press. The steel gauge used for the door outer panels was reduced. The anti-corrosion dipping process that had been applied to the W124's body in a full immersion bath, coating internal surfaces as comprehensively as external ones, was modified to reduce cycle time and chemical cost. The water-based paint system that replaced the solvent-based system used on the W124 was approved before the application technology had been fully mastered for the new chemistry's particular requirements around adhesion to the metal surface. And the underbody sealing compound, the thick rubberized layer that had protected the W124's floor and inner sills from road assault, was applied at reduced thickness and with reduced coverage. Each of these changes, reviewed individually in a cost reduction meeting, appeared defensible. Each represented a small departure from the W124's specification toward a specification that was still within the industry's normal quality range. Collectively, they created a vehicle that corroded at a rate that no Mercedes customer had experienced since the 1970s, and that no taxi operator had experienced from a Mercedes ever. There is a specific date that appears in accounts of the W210 crisis, 1998, 3 years after the car launched. At that point, the automotive press in Germany was publishing photographs of W210s, well-maintained, regularly serviced, garaged examples, with visible rust bubbling through the paint on the lower door panels. The cars were 3 years old. The W124, in comparable climates and conditions, would have shown no surface corrosion at 3 years. The contrast was visible to anyone who parked a W210 next to a W124 and looked at the door sills. The W210's visual identity was the first signal that something had changed, and it arrived before the rust gave the market a harder signal to process. The W124 had been designed by Bruno Sacco, who led Mercedes' design department from 1975 to 1999. Sacco operated from a specific design philosophy, vertical affinity, he called it, which held that every model in the Mercedes range should share a clear visual language that connected it to the larger, more prestigious models above it. The W124 looked like a smaller version of the W126 S-Class. Dignified, rectangular, built without styling gestures. Every line served a function. The Sacco planks, the plastic body-colored strips along the lower flanks, were aerodynamic elements first and protective strips second. Nothing on the W124 was there because a marketing person thought it would sell better with it. It was there because Sacco's teams had determined it belonged there. The W210 replaced the W124's single wraparound headlight units with 4 separate circular headlights, 2 on each side, stacked vertically. The design team's stated rationale was that the circular units gave the car a more modern and distinctive face, something that would differentiate it more clearly from the outgoing model in a market where visual novelty was increasingly rewarded. The automotive press at the time was divided. Some found the 4-circle arrangement bold and contemporary. The majority found it strange, a car that looked as if it had been designed by committee, with a styling feature that communicated decisiveness without actually achieving it. The German-speaking automotive press gave the face a nickname almost immediately, Vier-Augen-Gesicht, the four-eyed face. The term was not affectionate. It spread quickly, became standard in all subsequent coverage of the model, and attached itself to the W210 with the specificity that accurate nicknames always achieve. The car that was supposed to replace the elegant authority of the W124 became known by a feature that made it look, in the words of one prominent German critic, like a surprised insect. Mercedes acknowledged the problem. The 1999 facelift replaced the 4 circular units with oval headlights that restored a more coherent and authoritative front face. The criticism abated. The styling of the facelifted W210 was generally considered acceptable, and some examples with the later specification are genuinely attractive cars. But the 4-year window between the original launch and the facelift was the window during which the rust problem became public and the reputation damage occurred. The 4-eyed W210 was the W210 that rusted. The corrected styling arrived at the same moment as the corrected corrosion protection. By then, the conversation had moved beyond styling. The 4-eye headlight story matters for a reason that goes beyond aesthetics. It represents a shift in Mercedes' relationship with its customer base. The W124's customers had not needed the car to look exciting. They needed it to look permanent. The W210's 4 circular headlights were an attempt to make the car look exciting, in the hope that excitement would substitute for permanence. It was a bet on style over substance, at precisely the moment when the substance was being reduced to fund the style budget's margin. The market rejected both propositions simultaneously. The W210 is not without merit. Before cataloging its failures, the engineering achievements deserve acknowledgement because they are real and they are significant. The car that carries the W210 designation has been treated in much of the enthusiast press as simply a disaster, a cautionary tale about what happens when accountants replace engineers. That treatment is unfair to the engineers who worked on it and imprecise about where the failures actually occurred. The W210's drivetrain engineering, its safety systems, and its suspension calibration are not the products of a cost reduction culture. They are the products of Mercedes engineering teams doing their best work within the constraints applied to them. The failures are specific and structural. The achievements are real and deserve to be named. The ride quality is genuinely excellent. The suspension, a double wishbone front and 5-link rear, is well calibrated for the comfort mandate the engineers were given, and on smooth roads it provides a level of isolation that rivals cars costing considerably more. The low-speed compliance is particularly impressive. The W210 absorbs urban road imperfections with a sophistication that reflects genuine development investment. The specific calibration of the spring and damper rates, the compliance of the subframe mounting bushes, the geometry of the rear axle under load, these are the products of engineers who understood what a Mercedes buyer expected from the ride and delivered it. They had less money to work with than their predecessors. They spent it in the right place for the comfort brief they were given. The diesel engines available in the W210 are among the best ever fitted to a production car of any era. The OM 606 6-cylinder diesel that powered the E39 turbo diesel produced 177 horsepower from 3 liters in 1996, an extraordinary output for a diesel of the period, with a refinement and smoothness that the Mercedes diesel development program had been perfecting for 4 decades. The diesel's reputation at Mercedes was built on a specific engineering philosophy: cast iron construction, mechanical injection systems, conservative thermal management, and a service life that was expected to be measured not in years, but in decades. The OM 606 in the W210 was a direct descendant of this philosophy. It was over-engineered in the same way the W124's structure had been over-engineered, with materials and tolerances that far exceeded the minimum specification. The result was an engine that taxi operators in diesel markets reported running to 800,000 kilometers on its original internal components, changing oil and filters and little else. In markets where diesel fuel was cheaper than petrol and long-distance driving was the norm, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, the Middle East, the E300 TD was arguably the finest executive car available for any money, regardless of brand. It ran efficiently. It ran reliably. It ran in conditions that petrol engine competitors would not tolerate. The engine that Mercedes fitted to the W210's worst-remembered body was one of the finest diesel engines ever produced for a passenger car. The irony is precise and unresolvable. The safety engineering is thorough in ways that the cost reduction mandate demonstrably did not reach. The crash structure, the progressive deformation zones that absorb impact energy before it reaches the occupant cell, is excellently designed. Mercedes' Safety Research Division, which had been operating since the 1950s and had pioneered the crumple zone concept in production cars, continued to produce safety engineering that was among the best available. The W210 airbag systems and seatbelt pretensioners are sophisticated and reliable. The introduction of electronic stability program as standard on higher trim levels, one of the first production cars to offer it, represents a genuine safety contribution that has subsequently saved an enormous number of lives globally. The ESP story deserves its own paragraph because it represents the specific paradox of the W210. The same company that had reduced the steel gauge in its door panels to save cost was simultaneously developing and introducing one of the most important active safety technologies in automotive history. These are not contradictory decisions from the perspective of the corporate culture that made them. The ESP was a technology that could be sold. It had a price. It could be featured in advertising. It could be positioned as Mercedes innovation. The anti-corrosion treatment was invisible. It had no advertising value. It was the kind of cost that the financial culture Schremp had installed could not see as an investment, only as an expense. And expenses, when the mandate is a 30% reduction, are what you cut. The V8 engines available in the E430 and the E55 AMG are excellent. The M113 V8 in the E430 produces 279 horsepower, with a torque delivery so effortless that the car feels considerably faster than the number suggests. The engine's character, broad, uncomplicated, smooth in a way that only displacement can produce, makes the E430 a genuinely pleasurable car to cover long distances. The E55 AMG, produced in collaboration with AMG in a Falterbach with a hand-built 5.5-liter V8 producing 354 horsepower, is the W210 at its most compelling. It surpasses the E39 M5 in low-end torque. In the straight-line acceleration metric that most buyers actually use, the E55 AMG is the faster car. The riding experience, the sense of effortless, inexhaustible force, is something the M5's higher revving, more characterful engine does not produce in the same form. These achievements occur in the same car as the rusted door panels and the failed instrument clusters. This is the W210's specific tragedy. The excellence and the failure are inseparable. The body that houses the OM 606 diesel is the same body that rusts through at the lower door sills. The chassis that carries the ESP system is the same chassis whose spring perches corrode into structural failure. The engineering culture that produced the safety systems was constrained from applying the same investment to the corrosion protection. The result is a car that is simultaneously better and worse than it has any right to be. Better in the areas the development culture was permitted to develop properly, worse in the areas it was not. The W210 rust crisis unfolded publicly and in real time. It was not a problem that Mercedes acknowledged early and addressed proactively. It was a problem that owners discovered in their garages, that mechanics documented in repair records, and that the automotive press reported with a specificity and a frequency that made denial impossible. The door rust appeared first. On early W210s, the lower sections of the doors, particularly the rear doors, where the drainage apertures that were supposed to allow trapped moisture to escape were too small to function effectively in practice, began to show surface bubbling within 2 to 3 years of production. The thin steel was more susceptible to the corrosion initiated when the imperfectly applied water-based paint allowed moisture to penetrate to the metal. The bubbling expanded over the following years into full-depth perforations. On cars that were 3 years old and visually maintained, the lower door panels looked 20 years old. This was not the gradual, predictable rust of a vehicle approaching the end of its service life. It was aggressive, accelerating corrosion on a car that was, by any normal expectation, still new. The contrast with the W124 was documented by mechanics and taxi companies in Germany with a precision that made the engineering failure visible to anyone who looked. Taxi companies that had operated W124s for 8 and 10 years with minimal body corrosion were finding W210Es requiring door replacements at 4 years. The W124's galvanization had been applied to the body before painting in a full immersion bath, the Tauschlackierung process, that coated every surface, internal and external, to a uniform standard. The W210's process had been modified as part of the cost reduction program, reducing the coverage of the internal surfaces. What had been a comprehensive process became an adequate one. In a corrosive environment, the difference between comprehensive and adequate is measured in years of body life. The spring perch story is worse. In 1999, 4 years after the W210 launched, Mercedes issued a technical service bulletin, acknowledging that the rear spring perch housings on certain production periods were susceptible to corrosion and should be inspected. The language was measured. The implication was alarming. A structural component corroding through on cars that were 4 years old was not a quality control outlier. It was a systemic engineering failure. The spring perches are not decorative. They are the structural interface between the suspension system and the body, the point at which the forces generated by the road surface are transferred into the chassis. When they corrode through, the suspension spring loses its seating and can penetrate the body structure. In several documented cases, this occurred while the vehicle was in motion. Mercedes issued an extended warranty on affected components. They updated the anti-corrosion treatment for subsequent model years. The facelifted W210 of 1999 used improved steel specifications and better sealing. But the first 4 model years of W210 production, roughly 800,000 vehicles built before the corrections were implemented, retained the original specification. In Rust Belt markets, these cars were structurally compromised before many of their owners had finished paying for them. Jürgen Schrempp was, during these years, occupied with a transaction that dwarfed the W210 crisis in scale. In 1998, Daimler-Benz agreed to merge with Chrysler Corporation in a transaction valued at $36 billion. At the time, the largest industrial merger in history. Schrempp described it publicly as a merger of equals between 2 great automotive companies. Internal documents and subsequent legal testimony would establish that it was understood within Daimler as an acquisition from the beginning, and that the merger framing had been used specifically to manage the regulatory and political process. When this characterization became public through legal proceedings, the reputational damage to the company and to Schrempp personally was compounding. The company, whose cars were developing structural rust while still under warranty, had also conducted its largest transaction through what its own chief executive acknowledged was a misrepresentation. The W210's rust and the Daimler-Chrysler transaction are the same cultural story expressed in 2 different domains. A leadership culture that had decided that financial outcomes justified the means used to achieve them in both engineering and strategy. The electrical problems of the W210 form the second pillar of its reputation disaster, and they are in some ways more insidious than the rust because they are harder to quantify and easier to dismiss as individual variants rather than systemic failure. Rust is visible. You can photograph it. You can measure the depth of the perforations. You can show it to someone who has no automotive knowledge, and they will understand that something is wrong. Electrical failures are harder to document and easier for a manufacturer to attribute to maintenance failures or misuse. Mercedes took longer to acknowledge the electrical problems publicly, and the delay compounded the frustration of owners who were experiencing failures that dealers were having difficulty diagnosing. The instrument cluster pixel failure was the most widely documented. The instrument cluster used a vacuum fluorescent display, technology that was advanced and attractive at launch, producing a crisp, clean readout in the kind of cool green and amber tones that characterized late 90s premium electronics. The connection between the display elements and the circuit board degraded with age and heat cycling, causing segments of the display to go dark. An instrument cluster with dead pixels on a car that was 2 years old and 40,000 kilometers was not an isolated complaint from a neglectful owner. It was the common experience. It was so common that a secondary market of instrument cluster repair specialists developed specifically around the W210. Businesses that would remove the cluster, reflow the solder connections under heat, and return it to working condition for a fraction of the cost of a replacement. These businesses would not have existed if the failure had been rare. They exist because the failure was universal. The central locking system developed its own mythology. The W210's electrical architecture implemented one of the industry's early uses of a controller area network, a data bus that allowed the car's various electronic modules to communicate with each other rather than running dedicated wiring to each function. The concept was sound and would become standard in all modern vehicles. The W210's implementation, built to a cost specification that had been reduced as part of the Shrimp mandate, used connectors that were less robust and wiring insulation that was less durable than the system's architecture required. The result was a bus that generated communication errors that the modules could not resolve, producing behaviors, spontaneous door locking and unlocking, alarm triggers without cause, seat memory functions that overwrote themselves, that had no clear diagnostic path. Mechanics at Mercedes dealers described the W210's electrical system as uniquely difficult to trace. You could reproduce the symptom, but could not find the cause, because the cause was not a specific component failure, but a systemic communication degradation. Mercedes' own rental fleet, which operated primarily in the German business travel market, began transitioning away from W210S in 1998 toward BMW E39S. This transition was covered by the German trade press, specifically by the fleet management publications that tracked corporate vehicle decisions, and it was noted because the Daimler rental operations had been a loyal Mercedes customer through multiple model generations. Fleet operators evaluate vehicles purely on cost of ownership and customer satisfaction metrics. They do not pay premiums for badges or heritage. When Daimler's own fleet operations found the W210 too expensive to operate and the E39 more satisfactory, the commercial signal was unambiguous. The car that Mercedes had built to undercut BMW's engineering claim had instead confirmed it. The organic wiring insulation story completes the electrical picture. Mercedes approved wiring harness insulation compounds for some W210 production runs that incorporated natural materials rather than fully synthetic compounds, a decision that was consistent with the environmental manufacturing commitments the company had made publicly. The natural compounds performed adequately at ambient temperatures. In the heat cycles of an engine bay over 4 or 5 years of use, they degraded. The insulation that had been specified to last the vehicle's service life was failing within a fraction of that time, producing shorts on live conductors that could affect multiple systems simultaneously. The W124 had experienced a version of this same problem with biodegradable wiring insulation in its later production years, and the failure mode was known within Mercedes' engineering organization. The W210's organic insulation decision was made with awareness of what had happened on the W124. It was made anyway. The W210's failure did not occur in isolation. It occurred in the context of a luxury car market that had been watching the Japanese brand's reliability argument with increasing attention and was prepared to reconsider the assumption that German engineering automatically justified the premium it charged. The taxi companies were the most visible defectors, and their defection was the most commercially significant. In Germany, the long-wheelbase E-Class had been the standard taxi for decades. The choice was not sentiment, it was economics. Taxi operators run vehicles to very high mileages under hard daily use, and they evaluate every decision on cost per kilometer. The W124's durability had made it the economically rational choice for commercial operation. You paid more for it up front, but you ran it to 500,000 kilometers with minimal structural intervention, and the total cost of ownership was lower than any alternative. The W210 inverted this calculation. The structural rust required bodywork on vehicles that had not yet reached their first overhaul. The electrical failures required diagnostic time and component replacement that the W124 had not generated. The total cost of ownership was higher than the competition. Taxi companies that had run Mercedes fleets for a generation began ordering BMW E39 530s, and in the diesel markets, Volvo S80s and Audi A6s. The defection was visible in German cities from 1998 onward, and it was devastating as a signal because the taxi operator's choice carries a credibility that advertising cannot manufacture. The residual values told the same story with numbers. W210 E-320, purchased new in 1996 for approximately 60,000 Deutsche Marks, was worth, by 1999, approximately 22,000 Deutsche Marks, a depreciation of roughly 63% in 3 years. An E39 528 I purchased at a comparable price had depreciated by approximately 45% in the same period. The gap, 18 percentage points of additional depreciation on the W210, represented the market's real-time pricing of the W210's higher ownership costs and lower reliability expectations. Residual values are, in a sense, the most honest assessment of a vehicle available. They are set by people who buy and sell used cars professionally, who have no loyalty to any brand, and who price what they know about a vehicle's likely repair costs and customer appeal. The residual value gap between the W210 and the E39 was not a perception problem. It was an accurate valuation of a real difference. Mercedes' response to the crisis, measured against the standard set by their own W124 recall 20 years earlier, was inadequate. The W124 recall had involved dealers telephoning every owner personally, dispatching technicians to owners' homes, repairing the cars, refueling them, and returning them. The W210's rust and electrical response involved service bulletins, extended warranty coverage on specific components, and production process improvements for future vehicles. The contrast was noted repeatedly by the German automotive press, and it compounded the narrative that the company that had pioneered the standard of customer service in the luxury segment had abandoned that standard, along with the engineering culture that had made it possible. The W210 facelift of 1999 addressed the most visible problems. The 4 circular headlights that had been widely criticized, the Vier-Augen-Gesicht, the 4-eyed face, were replaced by a more conventional unit that gave the car a cleaner, more authoritative front end. The steel specification was improved. The galvanization process was revised. The instrument cluster was redesigned. Late production W210s, built after the facelift and after the manufacturing corrections were implemented, are meaningfully better cars than the early examples. Some owners who bought post-facelift variants from the final production years report ownership experiences that are genuinely satisfactory. But reputations are formed by what happened first, not what happened later. The 4-eyed W210 with the bubbling lower door panels was on every road in Germany. It was parked in taxi ranks alongside E39s that did not rust. It was the subject of television consumer reports and newspaper investigations and parliamentary questions about product liability. By the time the facelift arrived, the conversation about the W210 was over. The car had been judged, and the judgment was written into the market's residual value tables. into the taxi company's fleet choices, and into the institutional memory of every Mercedes customer who had replaced a door panel or a spring perch on a car that was 4 years old. The question this comparison forces is not simply which car was better. The E39 was better. The evidence is extensive and consistent, and a fair reading of it does not produce a different conclusion. The automotive press of the era said it. The residual value data confirmed it. The taxi companies demonstrated it with their purchasing decisions. The E39 was better, and it was not close. The question is, what the gap between these two cars tells us about how engineering cultures work, why they fail, and what they cost when they do. The E39 and the W210 were developed simultaneously in the same country, in the same segment, for the same buyers. They shared a heritage in the German engineering tradition that had produced in the previous generation two of the finest production cars ever built, the W124 and the E34. One of those two traditions was maintained into the next generation. The other was abandoned, and the consequences of that abandonment were visible on the roads of Germany within 3 years of the W210's launch. In terms of driving experience, the E39 is comprehensively superior. The steering communicates more, the chassis engages more precisely. The engine delivers its power with a refinement and a character that the W210's competent but less distinguished engines cannot match. Driving an E39 on a road that demands something from the chassis produces a specific pleasure, the pleasure of a well-calibrated instrument responding accurately to your inputs, that the W210 does not offer. The W210 is not unpleasant to drive. On smooth roads at moderate speeds, it is comfortable and competent and entirely adequate for its purpose. But when you ask it for something, when you push it into a corner at a speed that reveals the chassis' character, what you find is a car that has been tuned to manage, not to respond. It absorbs. It isolates. It produces a result that is acceptable rather than rewarding. This distinction would be minor in a family hatchback. In a car positioned as the choice of people who value what driving is, it is the whole argument. In terms of build quality, the E39 is again superior, but the gap requires qualification. The E39 is not the W124. The W124 was built to a standard of structural permanence and anti-corrosion thoroughness that the E39's development budget, 2 billion Deutsche Marks, is significant, but it is not unlimited, did not replicate. In the single most important dimension of build quality for the German market, where winter road salting is aggressive and ownership periods are long, the W124 remained the standard. But relative to the W210, which was built to a standard defined by a 30% cost reduction from the W124, the E39's build quality is dramatically superior. In the specific dimension that became the W210's defining failure, corrosion resistance, the E39 is not merely better but categorically different. The E39's doors do not rust through at 3 years. This is not an achievement that should require noting. It is a baseline expectation for a vehicle in this segment. The W210 failed to meet it. In terms of long-term ownership cost, the comparison is not close once the rust and electrical variables are introduced. An E39 maintained correctly costs money. The Vano seals will require attention on high-mileage examples. The cooling system's plastic components will fail and should be replaced preventively before they cause engine damage. The rear subframe mounting points should be reinforced on cars with significant mileage, a procedure that requires body shop facilities. These are real expenses, and an honest assessment of the E39 must include them, but they are predictable expenses. They are known failure modes with known solutions and known costs. An E39 owner who understands the car can build these costs into their budget and address them before they cascade into more serious failures. The W210's failure modes were not predictable in the same way because their severity was not understood when the cars were new. Owners who bought W210s in 1996 expecting W124 standard durability were not made aware that the anti-corrosion treatment had been reduced. They were not told that the steel gauge had been thinned. They were not informed that the instrument cluster would likely develop pixel failures within 2 years. They bought a Mercedes E-Class, which they understood to mean a specific standard of durability, and they experienced something that did not meet that standard. The damage to Mercedes' relationship with those customers was not a quality control issue. It was a trust issue. And trust, once broken with a luxury customer who bought a premium product on the basis of the brand's promise, is not easily restored. Here is the specific irony that makes this comparison historically important. Mercedes spent a decade, 11 years of the W124's production run, building a reputation for durability so strong that it became a default assumption in the luxury car market. Buyers did not ask whether a Mercedes would rust. They assumed it would not, because the W124 had demonstrated that a Mercedes did not rust. That reputation was commercially valuable. It justified the premium. It reduced the competitive pressure from lower-priced alternatives. And it created a reservoir of brand trust that buyers brought to the W210 showroom as a pre-existing condition. Jürgen Schrempp drew on that reservoir to finance the cost reductions. The W210 was priced as if it were the W124's equal because buyers assumed it was. The premium that customers paid for the W210 over a comparable BMW or Audi reflected the W124's reputation, not the W210's actual specification. Mercedes was, in effect, selling the W124's legacy while delivering the W210's reality. And when the W210's reality became apparent, when the rust appeared in the parking garages and the spring perches failed on the motorways, the reservoir of trust was not merely depleted, it was poisoned. The breach of expectation was not gradual. It was specific and visible and documented by the press in real time. BMW did the opposite. The E39 invested in the engineering experience, in chassis development, in engine character, in steering calibration, and created a reputation that has not just survived, but grown stronger with time. The E39 costs more to maintain as it ages than a simpler car would, but the maintenance costs are the price of owning something built with care, and the owners who choose to pay them understand what they are paying for. The E39 community is not a survival community. It does not bond over shared breakdowns and field repairs. It bonds over the shared understanding of what the car is, what it can do, and what it represents as an artifact of a specific moment in automotive history when the engineering culture had not yet been replaced by the financial culture. The E39 is the better car, but the comparison is about more than which car was better. It is about what happens when two companies face the same market at the same moment, with the same heritage and the same competitive pressure, and one of them chooses to protect the engineering and the other chooses to protect the margin. BMW chose the engineering. The E39 is the proof. Mercedes chose the margin. The W210's rusted door panels are the proof. And the gap between those two choices, the gap between a car that engineers still point to as the benchmark and a car that taxi drivers abandoned, is the gap between a company that understood its reputation as a product of its engineering and a company that believed its reputation was the engineering itself, something that existed independently of the decisions being made in the factory. One of those understandings is correct. Only one of them produces an E39. The W210 and E39 comparison also forces a question that goes beyond these two cars. It forces a question about what we actually pay for when we buy a luxury product. The premium price of a luxury car carries an implied promise. The promise is not that the car will be trouble-free. No mechanical device is trouble-free over time. The promise is that the engineering attention paid to the car's design is proportional to the premium charged for it, that the extra money went somewhere real, that the cost of the car reflects the cost of making it properly. The W210 broke that promise. It charged W124 level prices for a car built to a 30% less specification. The breach was not immediately obvious because the premium is paid at the point of purchase, and the consequence of the breach emerges 2 or 3 years later in a parking garage when the paint starts to bubble. By the time the customer understood what they had bought, the manufacturer had the money. The engineering had not been done, the premium had been paid. The promise had been broken. This is not unique to Mercedes or to the W210. It is a structural temptation that exists in every premium industry at every moment when an established brand considers whether it can charge for a legacy it is no longer fully maintaining. Some brands resist the temptation, some do not. The E39 and the W210 are the most clearly documented example in automotive history of what the two outcomes look like, because they occurred simultaneously, in the same market, and the results were measured and published in real time. Two German cars, same era, same segment, same heritage, completely different outcomes. The E39 arrived in 1995 as the expression of a specific engineering culture at its peak, a culture in which the chassis engineer was the most important person in the building, and the driving experience was the primary metric by which every decision was evaluated. It produced a car that the automotive press called the benchmark, that 20 years of subsequent development has not meaningfully surpassed in the quality of its chassis communication, and that the engineers who came after it point to, consistently and publicly, as the car they wish they could build again. The M5 variant could outrun a Ferrari. The standard 528 I could be driven by an unmarked police unit at sustained autobahn speeds without mechanical complaint. The Touring kept an estate car body rigid enough that BMW used it as the development platform for the sedan. These things were not accidents. They were the result of a specific way of making decisions, applied consistently over a 4-year development cycle. The W210 arrived in the same year as the direct successor to one of the most respected cars ever produced, shaped by a mandate to cost 30% less and driven by a corporate culture that had decided the W124's engineering excellence was excessive rather than foundational. It produced a car with genuine merit, the OM 606 diesel, the ESP stability system, the ride quality on smooth roads, surrounded by failures so visible and so specific that they defined the car's legacy before its production run had finished. The engineers who worked on it were not incompetent. They were constrained. The decisions that produced the rust and the electrical failures were made above them by people whose primary metric was the balance sheet rather than the panel gap or the corrosion protection schedule. There is a detail about the E55 AMG that sits at the center of the W210's specific tragedy. AMG in Affalterbach had been building performance versions of Mercedes vehicles since the 1960s. In 1999, Mercedes acquired a majority stake in AMG and integrated it fully into the corporate structure. The E55 AMG, built in the same W210 body that was rusting in parking garages, is hand-assembled at Affalterbach by a single engineer per engine, using the same one-man, one-engine philosophy that BMW's M division uses for the M5's S62. The AMG plaque on the engine bears the name of the technician who built it. The E55 AMG is, in the specific dimension of its engine construction, as carefully assembled as the M5. It sits in a body that corrodes at the lower door sills within 3 years of production. The craftsmanship and the compromise coexist in the same vehicle because they were funded from different budgets and built by different cultures within the same organization. The AMG culture had not yet been fully absorbed into the Shrimp culture when the E55 was developed. Its engine was built the old way, its body was not. Consider what this comparison asks of the industry. The W210's failures were not the result of negligence. They were the inevitable result of a 30% cost reduction mandate applied to a product that had no fat to remove. The engineers built the best car they could within the constraints given. The constraints were wrong, and the people who set the constraints were not uninformed. They understood at some level that they were removing things that mattered. The choice was made anyway, because the financial pressure was immediate and the consequence was delayed. The payment came on time, the rust came later. The E39's excellence was also not inevitable. It was the product of a specific moment, a window in BMW's history when Reitzle's engineering culture was still dominant, when the budget was sufficient, when the competitive pressure pushed the team to produce something exceptional. That window closed. Reitzle left in 1999. The E60 arrived in 2003. BMW's subsequent 5 series have sold in larger numbers. None of them have been called the finest driver's car in the executive segment. The window does not reopen. When the culture changes, the product changes. And when the product changes, the conversation about the brand changes with it. Both companies eventually recovered from the trajectories these cars represent. Mercedes addressed the W210's problems in the W211 that followed, a car that was more conventionally engineered, more carefully anti-corrosion treated, and considerably less controversial than its predecessor. BMW produced subsequent 5 series that sold in enormous numbers and were technically accomplished in many respects. But the recovery in both cases was measured against a lower standard than the one the previous generation had established. Neither the W211 nor the E60 is remembered as the finest car of its segment. They are remembered as competent successors to cars that were genuinely exceptional. The exceptional moment passed. What replaced it was adequate. And adequate is not what either brand had promised. What the E39 and the W210 tell us, standing together across a quarter century of hindsight, is this. The reputation of a luxury product is not a function of its marketing. It is a function of the decisions made in the engineering departments, 3 to 5 years before the product reaches the customer, by people whose names will never appear in the advertisements. When those people are given the resources and the mandate to do something exceptional, an E39 results. When those people are given a cost reduction target and told to find the savings, a W210 results. The engineers at BMW knew this. The engineers at Mercedes knew this. The people who handed the W210's team their brief knew this too. They made the choice anyway. And 25 years later, the roads of Germany still carry the evidence of both choices. An E39 with a documented service history sells for 15,000 euros to buyers who understand what it is. A W210 with surface rust sells for 2,000 euros to buyers who understand what that is. The gap between those prices is not the gap between a good car and a bad car. It is the gap between a promise kept and a promise broken. The market never forgets, and neither does the metal. Now, click on this next video if you want to see what happens when the same question, engineering excellence versus engineering compromise, plays out not in German boardrooms, but on American trails. The Jeep Cherokee XJ versus the Toyota 4Runner, one built from desperation with borrowed parts and known weaknesses, the other built from a clean sheet with every resource it needed. Only one of them became a legend. And the reason might surprise you. It is right there on your screen.